Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second season of The Fourth Leg. This is your host, Philip Reiner. This series is focused on one of the most complex systems in the world today, nuclear command, control, and communications, and its increasingly complicated future. With this series, together with our partner Peter Hayes at the Nautilus Institute, we're going straight to the experts across multiple sectors to discuss the technical and policy challenges associated with NC3. Specifically, here in Season 2, we will discuss the necessity for a secure global crisis communications capability. There's a great deal to cover, so let's get started. Today, we are pleased to welcome Paul Bracken back to the podcast. He's a professor of management and political science at Yale University. His most recent book, The Second Nuclear Age, analyzes the dynamics of a multipolar nuclear security order. Paul is someone who is widely respected in this space. We see him really as one of the NC3 originals. He's someone who has written extensively on command and control, but also Asian security, net assessment, cyber conflict, and innovation. And he was recently included in the Princeton Reviews, the best 300 professors in America. And today, we're going to dig into the details of the paper that he submitted as part of our workshop last fall. The paper's title is Communication Disruption Attacks in NC3. Paul, thank you again for joining us for another iteration of the Fourth Leg podcast. This is really such a critical set of issues. We're really happy to have you back.
It's good to be here, Philip.
Before diving into a discussion around all things NC3 and communications and the risks and vulnerabilities posed by 21st century modernization efforts in your paper, Communication Disruption Attacks in NC3, I wanted to take a quick step back. And if I could ask you to tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and perhaps a little bit about your origin story as someone who has spent so many years now thinking about these complex issues. How did you get into all of this to begin with?
Sure, I'd be happy to say a few words on that front. I grew up in Philadelphia and did my undergraduate college work at Columbia University in engineering in a field called operations research, which is kind of like applied mathematics. And on graduation, I had no idea what I wanted to do, but I came across an ad in the Washington Post for a national security junior analyst at a company in Roslyn, Virginia. I never served in the military. My family didn't, and I knew nothing about the military at all. I grew up in sort of the anti-Vietnam War generation, which was pretty intense at Columbia. Anyway, I got the job and was immediately sort of thrown into really fascinating projects, namely one of which was to look at the use of urban sprawl in Western Europe for defense fortification reasons against the Warsaw Pact attack. And I worked at that at this company in Roslyn, Virginia for 2 years, pretty much as an engineer. Learned about a big, wider world of policy, and after 2 years or so, sent a blind resume into Herman Kahn at the Hudson Institute. And I was sitting in my office one day overlooking the Marine Corps monument, right in Roslyn there. And I got a call, and it was from Herman, who I couldn't even understand. He would talk so quickly. But in essence, he was saying, can you meet me at National Airport like in 20 minutes for a job interview? So I went over there, and we hit it off right away, and he hired me. And I worked for Herman Kahn at the Hudson Institute in the 1970s into the early 80s. For 10 years, I worked for Herman. And it was really an extraordinary experience because, quite literally, one week I was going up to Aberdeen Proving Ground, and we were blowing up bunkers to see what artillery shells would do against targets. And then literally a month later, I was in Croton-on-Hudson, New York. That's where Hudson used to be. And I was told to go to Washington and go meet Herman at the White House because he had a meeting with Vice President Rockefeller, and my job was to be the bag carrier. So it was like really a very extraordinary experience. You would come down to lunch, and you would find there the deputy director of the CIA. Kissinger might be there. Ed Teller was there. Albert Wohlstetter. And I knew all these people, and I was working with them, and I was like 26. So after 10 years, I decided to go back and took a PhD at Yale in operations research. Again, it's like applied mathematics. They have a department at that time. So I was kind of credentialed, and Yale offered me a job as an assistant professor, which I turned down because I wanted to work with Herman and Hudson. And then a few months later, Herman died very suddenly. So I called Yale back up and I said, "Does the job offer still stand?" And they called me back a couple of days later and say yes. So I started teaching at Yale, and my dissertation was on command and control of nuclear forces, which was published as a book. And it was reviewed on the front page of the New York Times Book Review by McGeorge Bundy very favorably. So I got tenure in 2 years. And I didn't have to put up with the horror show that junior academics have to put up with. Probably a lot of your listeners will be familiar with that.
Yeah, with that pain cycle, that's absolutely fascinating. How did that journey pan out for you?
Back in the 70s, early 80s, the field was not as ideological as it is today. Because today, the first question that junior people are sort of sensitive to, and I see this in the PhDs at Yale, is like, what team are you on? But it was much less that way when I was growing up and entering the field. So I was doing a lot of work while at Hudson and as a professor at Yale with Dick Garwin, Kurt Gottfried, Hans Beta was on our team. We would have summer studies at Cornell. And then I got a letter when the book came out, Command and Control. I had like a one-line cursory letter from Jimmy Carter, who was retired at that point and living in Plains, Georgia, saying he really enjoyed the book, thought it was raising interesting issues, and if I was ever down his way to come see him. So I gathered Kurt Gottfried and Dick Garwin, and we went down to Plains, Georgia. It's not easy to get to Plains, Georgia. Let me just say that. And we spent a day or half a day with Jimmy Carter. And that was really, really interesting to talk to somebody who had direct experience with the nuclear trigger and took a high level of personal interest in it.
I think it goes without saying that your early work, along with a couple of the others that you note in your paper, is really, it's seen as some of the NC3 originals work on these topics. It really has informed myself. I think it's safe to say I can argue that for many of the folks who have been involved in this project, that was foundational work for all of us. So immensely thankful for that. If we could turn then maybe to your more recent insights in this same vein, though. So we had this workshop last fall. You were able to participate again. So thank you again for your generous contribution of your time, but also for this thought piece on what communication disruption attacks mean for NC3 going forward. In your paper, you talk a lot about the third C and its relatively low level of importance, seemingly, in planning. The workshop we conducted in the fall, as you recall, was very much focused on that third C and how technological change is putting those systems at even greater risk than they already were. But your discussion and your paper really starts to take this to another level of consideration with some policy recommendations. Maybe we could start out for the listeners and just have you walk them through the argument that you lay down in the paper.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that, Philip. The basic argument is that the United States unilaterally should make a clear distinction in its planning on attacks on communications which are incidental to other operations, collateral damage to communications, so to speak, and attacks which are intended to directly destroy the enemy's communication system. It's my belief that this is not done now. It's divided off into largely bureaucratic compartments, and nobody has this particular one. I think the reasons for making the distinction are important, which is chiefly that if you don't make this distinction, you're going to have a lot of destruction of communications, which in the nuclear context that we're entering, along with these other technologies I'm sure we'll get into, is very likely to lead to considerable unnecessary escalation, which doesn't get either side any benefit, it seems to me. Now, we could go into like why and how this has come about bureaucratically, but I would make the point that I'm not condemning anybody. I'm not calling for a no attack on communications. I'm calling for a clear line in our own minds before we could even get into a discussion with the Chinese or the Russians. And that what's happening now is what happened in the Cold War, which is to say the overwhelming focus of attention in the Cold War, both intellectual attention, planning, and dollars spent in weapon systems, was on large-scale wars, which would be so destructive that there was an automatic deterrent to them. What got a lot less consideration was low-level crises and finding a way that in a world where most players, two players back then, more today, did not want large-scale escalation, what actions could they take to keep the level of destruction low? And my answer to that is one very important one, is to have clarity in our own minds about whether we were attacking the enemy communications intentionally to destroy it, or whether it was an incidental collateral impact of military operations.
I look forward to digging into the various elements of this, and I want to be sure to pull Alexa and Leia into the conversation as we go through this as well. They've got some questions for you, but right up front, as we were just discussing at the outset there, you're someone who's spent many a decade around these bureaucracies. You note that is really, quite honestly, not the way this is considered today. The recommendation is a powerful one. How do you think that could be actually operationalized within the U.S. bureaucracy, seeing how resigned or reticent they are against such clarity?
Well, it's a good question. And I think the answer is what I tell my students at Yale in my business courses. I teach in the business school, is we have to lower our standards. People are shocked when I say that, but by lowering the standards, I mean giving a little bit of attention to crises in a nuclear context that could escalate into something in a world where both sides do not want it to escalate. All right. If one side wants it to escalate, then I sort of give up at the outset. But I think increasingly in East Asia and with great power rivalry, we are in a world where neither side wants any of these crises to escalate into major war. So we can go back and look at historical examples of how people did this back in the Cold War. And one of the things they did was to make rational arguments and studies. And as you correctly point out, these had very little impact. Another way is to stage war games built around crisis management, where you have a risk of escalation that neither side wants. And I think that helped somewhat. We still grossly gave too much attention to big all out wars and not enough to smaller scale contingencies, which is what it's all about. And I think another thing we could do today is to start thinking about track two arms control, pointing this out to various players like Russia and China. So, for example, I've been spending a lot of time recently reading Chinese doctrine associated with their nuclear forces. And I find absolutely no recognition or sensitivity whatsoever to the exigencies of crisis management, central control, where political leaders are making the decisions. And I think they're even more grossly unprepared for this than we are. I bet if we do more studies and articles on this subject, we will get their attention. They may not do anything about it, but it has to get their attention. It surely did in the Cold War. Let me mention one final source, an unpleasant one of nuclear learning, so to speak, and that is the way we learned about these things in the Cold War was not through studies, not very much in war games, which didn't have large impact. What produced it all was crises. Crises are the mother lode of learning about complicated things that you hadn't thought about before. And we were climbing a learning curve from 1950 or so, probably through the early 1970s. And this learning curve, we may have to climb a new, different learning curve. And we just all hope naturally that the crises are small enough to manage. But to look at crises as a sequence rather than a one off is a very useful way to get some of these systems and thinking into the bureaucracy.
Diving a little bit deeper into your policy recommendation laid out in your paper, what do you expect to be the outcome of distinguishing between the intended and unintended communications disruptions?
Well, one outcome, which if it developed, I would be extraordinarily ecstatic, I would say, is to have an annex in every war plan, every contingency plan drawn up by Stratcom, Cybercom, or Paycom, and others, that had an annex which estimated damages to communication system of the enemy. And if it gets into the annexes of these plans, then you have to brief it to the decision maker. The situation is not dissimilar to where collateral damage was treated in the Cold War, which, as most people know, in the early days, 50s and 1960s, collateral damage was treated as a bonus payoff. If a nuclear attack or even a heavy conventional B-52 attack took out cities and production capacity, this was considered a fortunate plus. Well, we know what happened in the 60s and into the 1970s is that the U.S. military recognized this is not the way to think about civilian unintended damage. And much of what the Vietnam War was about was finding ways to inflict military damage on the North Vietnamese and to some extent their suppliers in ways that didn't kill a lot of civilians. And we did this through a number of mechanisms. We're all familiar with restraints on operations and things like that. But by the early 1970s, nobody would walk into brief any president of either party and give them a plan that didn't have some consideration for the civilian collateral damage consequences. And I'd like to see the same thing happen. And this is why I think it is feasible. This is a winnable argument. Because if you went back to 1960, and I've read, before my time, but people would say, well, civilians always get killed in war, and you're telling us you can't have civilians killed. No, what we're saying is we have to give the decision maker an estimate of how many civilians will be killed. And we can give a decision maker estimates of the destruction to communications today. This has to do with my definition of a realistic war plan and a realistic operations plan. And it's one where you go in to see the president and he doesn't throw you out of the office because you're giving him a plan for World War III that you haven't thought through the consequences. That is a considerable danger today, that we really don't have effective operations which are not so escalatory that any president, no matter how liberal or how conservative, Republican or Democrat, hawk or dove, is going to toss you out of the office, because we're not going to go to World War III to defend the Baltic states or Taiwan. This is made worse by these new technologies, which, because they're so new, are poorly understood by the organizations which carry them out.
Given today's environment that we live in, you mentioned emerging technologies, the lack of understanding of them, of their vulnerabilities, of even their positives to this environment. Do you see your recommendation as applicable for both threats to the United States as well as a strategy towards its adversaries?
Yeah, if I understand the question correctly, these are things which we could do unilaterally on our own side without having to get into a discussion about a treaty with a foreign power. It's also, we want to communicate them to other major powers and other countries that we are considering these things, with the strong suggestion that they do likewise. This, again, is something harkening back to the Cold War. One of the things Robert McNamara did as Secretary of Defense, he made a color movie of the two-man rule for nuclear weapons, demonstrating how it was carried out in the Strategic Air Command and in the European Command. And he had a copy sent to the Russians without any commentary. It had a cover from some minor official saying, you might want to look at this, to get them to think about how this applies to their own force. We're pretty clearly in a world where arms control formal discussions between the U.S. and China and Russia, three powers, is unlikely to happen for the next few years at least. But I can tell you, I firmly believe that it will come back. If you were to go back to the Cold War, the height of the Cold War in 1957 and 58, and say, we need to talk about arms control with the Soviet Union, people would say, well, you simply don't understand the Soviet threat to the international system. Why do we want to talk to these people? We have to stand up to them. If you go fast forward to 1967, you had President Johnson meeting with senior Russian officials to talk about arms control. In 10 years, you went from a world where all of the talk was new weapon systems. Arms control gets zero attention in 1957 to 1967, in which all you could talk about was arms control. And they were clamping down on the Air Force's new replacement for the Minuteman missile. And every other system was killed off in the mid to late 1960s, largely because of its impact on arms control. So we can't look at these worlds as being static. They're dynamic. They will change.
With all this in mind, how can attention be increased on the importance of communications in deterrence thinking and planning? For instance, in the US, it will be hard, but in China, assuming likely even more difficult.
Right. I think a lot could be done on this. I think the two you mentioned it's a good distinction. In other words, look at the problem, how we do it in the United States. How would you do it in China? Let's take the China one first because it seems more difficult. At least to me it does, but I don't work inside or close to the Beltway. To people I know inside the Beltway, it looks harder to change our government than the Chinese government. Let's leave that for another day. Let's look at a study that I really think should be done, and I've just actually proposed it with unknown impact as yet, called non-standard wars. We have standard wars and non-standard wars. This applies to all countries, and it applies in the China case. Say, well, what is a standard war for China? A standard war for China is keeping the U.S. maritime forces at bay in the Western Pacific so that they can launch an attack or coerce Taiwan, or that they could reinforce the military presence on the islands that they've so assiduously constructed over the last few years, or perhaps even to intimidate Japan or Korea. What is a non-standard war for China? I can find no recognition in any Chinese military doctrine or leadership speeches of the rather obvious fact that China is the only country in the world surrounded by 5 nuclear powers. That is to say, Russia, North Korea, India, Pakistan, and the United States. And I find this truly astonishing that they haven't noticed their own geography, particularly for China, because the whole origin of the China state created by Mao Zedong in 1949 is that they were born, so to speak, in a world of nuclear superpowers when they were neither nuclear nor a superpower. And that as early as 1950, we're in a war with a nuclear enemy, the United States, and later in a crisis in Taiwan in the late 50s, a couple of these crises, which their erstwhile ally, the Soviet Union, precipitously withdrew their nuclear umbrella protecting China and withdrew their technical support for a Chinese bomb. So the origin of the Chinese state is that they're thrown into this world with a very weak hand competing against nuclear superpowers. And I'll just add that if you want a good example of a non-standard war, simply go to 1969 when China, facing their bitter enemy, the United States, goes on nuclear alert with this nascent 1969 force in a way that is directed at the Soviet Union, not the United States. And we could give many other examples of this, like how the Cold War developed and the U.S. played with China on the nuclear front. But my point is, doing several studies of non-standard wars that China could get into, because China's, quote, allies, if you want to call North Korea and Pakistan allies, or Russia, are much more likely to be the sources of catastrophe for both the Chinese state and the Chinese people than is the United States. I just see this as such an obvious geostrategic reality that I think we could win this by doing appropriate outside work.
So, Paul, in light of what you were just discussing about China and learning curves, in your paper you mentioned that there's this learning curve for nuclear interactions that you can apply to countries. What can be done to push that learning curve for all countries so that no one is left behind with a less established understanding short of actual conflict? I think of South Asia and other countries who may have become nuclear countries far later than the United States, Great Britain, Russia, and France, and therefore might not have dealt with this previous period of nuclear rivalry. Are they in a way ahead of the curve because they had to meet the moment more quickly, or do they lack some sort of experience having missed the early years of the nuclear Cold War?
Yeah, good points. I think each country has its own history. There is a clear learning curve between India and Pakistan. It's not a smooth curve, and I'm not saying it's not a risky curve, but they have learned to live with each other of a sort in a way that does remind me of the 1950s and 60s and the Cold War. And I've been to India and to strategic conferences all over. And Indian scholars all say the same thing. The Cold War is unique. You don't understand India, Professor Bracken. And my response is always, well, I may not understand India, but I do understand the technologies. And if you're telling me that radar and early warning systems operate differently in India than they do in the Western textbooks on radar, then I will concede your argument. But I don't think that's the case. So each country is different, and this means we've got to do a bit more work because we're not just looking at a two-player game anymore. But I believe there's many things that really could be done. Let me say one more illustration of the power of studies. I'm writing a piece now, one element of which is if you ask who is building the communications infrastructure for both Pakistan and northern India, the answer is it's a Chinese company, namely Huawei. And Huawei is going to have keen insight into the warning and alerting process of these two nations. And it's hard for me to believe that if some academic papers come out on that somebody in India will not notice the strategic consequences of this, which I'm not sure even what they are, but it's very interesting because it's multipolar. It's not Cold War. It's second nuclear age where we are today. But it also gets you into this whole world that the technologies are so different today than they were back in the Cold War era.
So, Paul, do you think that a learning curve, as you discuss in your paper, is slowed down or is sped up by the lack of nuclear crisis we've seen in recent years relative to the Cold War era? Do you think that countries that have had less experiences with nuclear crises in recent years would have a slower learning curve? For example, Israel comes to mind, having had less experience with nuclear crises recently relative to India and Pakistan.
Yeah, that is also something worth underscoring. Nuclear learning curves can accelerate for a variety of reasons, one of which are political crises. The Russians moved missiles into Cuba in 1962, and other similar examples. But yet another source of a learning curve is new technologies coming in. So when the United States, for example, shifted to the Minuteman Force in the early 1960s, it removed the necessity of launching early to ensure the survival of the force. In other words, with Minuteman and the Poseidon submarines, the submarine launched ballistic missiles of the early 60s, the United States could ride out an attack. And this was enormously stabilizing. And it actually created the path for the arms control of the mid-late 1960s, that the U.S. didn't feel so threatened by an out-of-the-blue surprise attack anymore. And I use this to illustrate how technology, independent of politics, can change the speed and slope of the nuclear learning curve. And there's a number of new technologies today, from cloud computing to stealth and anti-satellite weapons, data analytics, which simply had no parallel in the Cold War. There were new technologies. So one of the things I'm always a little bit upset about is when somebody says, well, these crises and interactions are at bottom political. It seems to me that that simply isn't true. They're political in some cases, and others they're technological, and in yet other cases, it's a combination of the two.
Continuing on this learning theme, I just want to reference some of the 9/11 communication failures in the US, both with the FAA call coming in and then with the second communications breakdown, the government plan for protecting US leadership and ensuring that it had control over the military. Using the 9/11 communication failures as an example, when a communication failure happens, that shows a flaw in the system. Do these errors usually bring up concerns in other countries? Do you think that perhaps the US learning curve on communication vulnerability improved by observing the communication failures in other countries?
I definitely think the U.S. communication failures of 9/11 improved because from the after action reports of what happened on 9/11, people did learn from them. The whole creation of DNI, which is really a kind of a connecting the dots organization, so that the right hand of DoD will know what the left hand is doing and might even know what the Federal Aviation Administration is doing in the future. Not guaranteed to work, but then again, nothing's guaranteed to work. But I think there's a number of complicated issues that surfaced in the 9/11 attack that haven't gotten the appreciated attention that they deserve. I'll just say the fact that on 9/11, Stratcom had a long planned, completely unrelated to the 9/11 attacks, nuclear war game exercise where they were not going to put nuclear weapons into the air, but they were moving them around at various Air Force bases, in particular Barksdale in Louisiana. And as you recall, when the president took off in Air Force One after being told that Washington was under attack and New York City was under attack, they didn't know where they were going, so they had to land somewhere because they were going to run out of gas. And they decided to go to a secure Air Force base, Barksdale. So you have the President of the United States in Air Force One with a surprise landing onto an airfield that's strewn with live nuclear weapons. I mean, you can't write this. If I wrote this and send it to Hollywood, they wouldn't believe it, okay? But I can give you a dozen examples in the Cold War where exactly the same thing happened. In 1958, one of the Russian officials, I forget who, was flying down to Damascus. They were leaning to the Soviet Union at the time. And when he flew back, the Russian Air Force did a surprise sent up the MiGs from Syrian air bases that they had there to protect and honor this aircraft. This was interpreted as NATO as a surprise nuclear alert. And they were simply they thought they were honoring their leader. And let me put it this way. What the Cold War shows happened on 9/11, which is your standard 5 or 6-fold freak coincidence of events happens. It shouldn't happen according to probabilities, but it does. Okay. So we need to be cognizant of this. I don't think the Chinese are at all cognizant of this, just as an aside to my earlier comments. And there's just a lot of ground that we could make a contribution to here of raising the level of discussion inside the bureaucracy. When you were asking me about my origin working with the Albert Wohlstetters and Herman Kahns and Tom Schellings, I mean, the key thing that they did in the 1950s and early 1960s is to break the US government's monopoly on nuclear strategic thinking. So I don't think it's useful to get into a debate whether Kissinger was right or Herman Kahn was wrong or Schelling did this or that. Their service was immeasurable because they broke the stranglehold that a brain dead bureaucracy had on the most important issues of world order for that era. And I think we're in a similar time today.
That takes us perfectly into a little bit more of a detailed discussion around some of the stuff we got into and in the fall. I couldn't agree with you more. I think we're most definitely in another era. It's actually even more disconcerting to a certain degree because back then, those outside strategic thinkers had a grasp of the technological developments, I think, in a way. It's very rare to find those who are perhaps outside the bureaucracy today who have that real depth on both sides of the calculus. I want to build off of something you were just talking about in terms of the lessons learned from 9/11, if I could. You note in the paper, and this is, I think, well understood, that no complex system is going to perform well under conditions that it doesn't anticipate happening. We've talked a little bit in this conversation about emerging technologies. We've done so in more depth in the past. I'm curious as to your thoughts. A lot of conversation about integrating things like machine learning and deep learning into command and control. We've written about this a little bit. What are your thoughts on integrating things like deep learning to help anticipate these sorts of communications crises moments? Is there some way to integrate these sorts of novel technologies to help aid the performance of these systems without introducing new vulnerabilities? Or are we really setting ourselves up for really, as you described it, more complex, unanticipated interactions of these systems with behavior that we can't anticipate?
Okay, another really deep, good question. There is a tendency to look upon DoD writ large, to include the intelligence community, as brain dead and bureaucratic, and even I have used those terms. It did learn over extended periods of time. And even the Soviet Union learned over extended periods of time. And I could point to other national examples. So I think this is the only world that we have. We do not seem to be moving into a world of nuclear abolition or the irrelevance of nuclear weapons. I would be happy if we did. I'm a big supporter of global zero, but I just don't see it happening. But there are troubling aspects here, but there's also very useful ones. So, for example, you mentioned deep learning. And I'm going to distinguish deep learning from ordinary machine learning in the sense we're getting into the really new technologies like using hidden Markov chains and things like that. But the United States is going to be able to, or China will be able to look at their enemy, other forces, and be able to have a much deeper, richer understanding of what they're up to and what they're doing. So, for example, something I'm really interested in today is the use of mobile land-based missiles. Every country in the world has basically moved to that has nuclear weapons, in particular Pakistan and North Korea. So if you carefully monitored from a deep learning perspective what North Korea is up to, we would have a much keener insight of where their exercises are taking them, whether it's for purposes of bluff or they're simply posturing, the dispersal of their mobile missiles and their warheads, which are kept separately. This is an absolutely critical issue that is being looked at today, but it's being looked at purely from the tactical bottom-up point of view, not from the point of view of controlling escalation by senior decision makers who will be brought in a real situation. I mean, it's simply that on alert, the North Koreans are going to alert their missiles and their warheads. They have to go through several stages of interlinking these things. And if we don't carefully look at the exercises that they do in peacetime, we will not be able to see what they're up to in a serious crisis. Because at some point, the North Koreans will develop an ICBM and a hydrogen bomb of sorts, even if it's not a true hydrogen bomb of the kind that Livermore would design. It'll do enough damage to Los Angeles, it'll ruin your day. And I mean, we really need somebody to look at these things. And I would say the same, it's my belief that this is the reason China is so interested in deep learning AI. So, because they're doing exactly this, looking at U.S. maritime forces in a control system which is so complex because the different parts, U.S. ships, airplanes, satellites, drones, submarines, they're all moving around. And so they're not in one spot very long. The only way you can grasp and integrate all this sensor information is with AI-driven systems. And I think this is what the Chinese are doing, in my opinion, is try to scale this up to a fantastic level. It's really quite an astonishing system that I don't think we appreciate, like what would happen if it worked or how to make sure it doesn't work.
It's one that I think gets back to the conversation around nuclear learning. In my mind, at least, when you begin considering the rather opaque nature of the deep learning approaches, the vulnerabilities that they create, inherently things that the behavior that they engage in that is kind of unexpected and really can't be addressed in advance. I think it introduces problems that we don't really understand. And so that nuclear learning that you're talking about, you're introducing elements to that learning curve that really are not things that you want to toy with. You don't really want to have to go through a phase, for instance, India and Pakistan, where you're signaling and trying to figuring out how these systems interact with one another while trying to avoid nuclear war. It seems like we may not want to go down that path, but it's the one that we're on. Pointing back to the conversation back last fall, one of the things that we really seized on in this spectrum of communications challenges was trying to come up with technical means that can provide a greater level of confidence, perhaps acknowledging your point that there needs to be a better delineation between those comm systems that we meant to strike, those that we don't, that was inadvertent and that we shouldn't, but recognizing that there needs to be communications in the event of a crisis, whether things are, missiles are flying and it's already to a certain degree too late, or in advance of that to try and de-escalate a situation, prevent that sort of a launch scenario. We talked about this Catalink system, and I really wanted to get your thoughts on this idea of building a secure, reliable, trustworthy comms capability that heads of state could take advantage of in these situations, potentially decreasing the risk of nuclear war. Just want to get your thoughts on what we had proposed last fall.
Well, I thought it was a terrific idea. And I think we can add to the technology of this system. Let me just point out that the idea of a hotline, a direct communication link between Washington and Moscow, was proposed, I think, in 1957, 58, 59, dismissed out of hand by the politicians and the military of the day. And we didn't have it during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But during the Cuban Missile Crisis, they discovered they couldn't communicate reliably to Moscow or their allies in Europe or South America. And if you recall, they were bringing in the South Americans to create this organization to make it look like a broad-based coalition, which it was. And they didn't have the telephone circuits to do that. And one of the outcomes of the Cuban crisis was they finally deployed the hotline. Example of learning by crisis. Let me say a couple of things about the proposal you're talking about, Philip, and that is we need to alert senior decision makers in Washington, Moscow, and Beijing if their forces are about to do dangerous things or the consequences of what they're authorizing. And we have some new technologies which allow you to do this One that I know Peter Hayes is quite interested in is what's called Byzantine fault-tolerant systems. Byzantine in the sense of the Byzantine Empire. This is a technical mathematical basis, which is actually the foundation for blockchain. And it's being used on Wall Street today in many different ways. But basically, you go around and you check. You do when you make a decision, you double, triple check it among different centers that they're not doing anything to conflict with it. And as far as I know, no one is looking at Byzantine fault tolerant systems in a crisis management setting. And even the terminology and the set of distinctions that Byzantine fault tolerant systems bring in is a very useful way to get at the complexity of these problems. So I'm not saying we won't ever solve them, but we could raise the level of discussion. Just a concrete example, if the president or the head of China were to authorize a limited strike, they may be authorizing several other packages of operations in space that will blind the other side, and they will not know this. Byzantine fault tolerant systems can get at this issue and at least address it in a framework.
I'm really glad you brought up the Byzantine general problem, Paul, because like you said, this is something that yourself and Peter Hayes, who's also part of this project, are very familiar with. Within the context of NC3, it also affects the calculus of external nuclear weapon state, not just the domestic NC3 structure. Could you elaborate a little bit more on why this problem is fundamentally problematic to nuclear command and control and whether there's any way to solve it? Really quickly, just wanted to give examples, perhaps the DPRK, which may come apart at the seams with little to no warning, or a state like the US, how this problem applies differently to each.
Sure. I think North Korea today could easily split apart into 2 or 3 different factions. Or if suppose it was 3, 1 or 2 of them might have control over nuclear weapons. We need the U.S. intelligence system to recognize this, to see if it is fissioning before our eyes. I would say the same is true of Pakistan. I would say you have this issue in Israel too, where you have these big, huge organizational distinctions between the Israeli Air Force, the Mossad, and the Atomic Energy Commission in Israel. That these, in many ways, it's even worse in Israel because of the thickness of the security. But we need an intelligence assessment that will tell our leaders whether North Korea is splintering into 4 or 5 nuclear factions. Because if that were happening, that is a scenario where significant use of U.S. force to eliminate it would be called for. And it's a much more likely contingency, it seems to me, than the all-out assault across the 38th parallel.
Yeah, I think the questions that you raise in terms of thinking about how communications have to factor into deterrence strategies, but also attack plans and the annex idea that you put forward is a really powerful one. This notion, though, that there might be other ways to shore up the communication systems and make them more resilient, I think is one that we're going to continue to pursue. We can't have this conversation, though, in light of all that's going on in the world without bringing up the pandemic and really getting your thoughts as someone who's given this some thought and thinking about how the COVID-19 crisis impacts things like NC3, how it may highlight deficiencies in our comms capabilities, whether in the US or outside the US. Does it increase the risk of a nuclear exchange?
Sure, we can't not notice a couple obvious things. First of all, it's taken out a good part of the U.S. striking power in the Pacific. Number one, I would say another thing, it has caused splits in the senior levels of the U.S. command and control system, represented by the dismissal of the Secretary of the Navy for how this non-standard event that came out of nowhere, COVID, had not been thought about And so a lot of mistakes were made in public, forcing heads to roll for political reasons, small p, political reasons. As to the larger issue, I think this was so unexpected that it draws attention once again to what I would consider the fundamental formula of policy analysis when it comes to national security, which is we cannot look only at the likely cases. The spread of COVID 1 year ago was considered unlikely by everyone. And so what they did was not consider it at all. It's not that they considered it in the wrong way, okay? What it led to was thoughtlessness, not the wrong model, okay? And there's a big difference between thoughtlessness. To stockpile a couple of million face masks is so trivially inexpensive. It's astonishing to me that the United States, nor France, nor other countries did this. This isn't even getting the ventilators yet. What does it cost to put a mask, in a stockpile and rotate it around? Management 101. So we have to look at the consequences, not the likelihood. That applies to the subject we're discussing this afternoon here, which is nuclear operations. And on an even grander stage, I would say that could it lead to nuclear war? I don't see it as directly leading to nuclear war, but I think how the world responds to really big issues, such as nuclear weapons, COVID-19, climate change, and I could give others. It raises the key issues that will countries cooperate? The nation state is not disappearing. Some people think that's the solution. Maybe they're right, but it doesn't seem to be happening. We're moving or have moved to a world which was at one time cooperative, but is now, I think the best term I like to use is inward looking. But it's a very inward looking world in which the United States is looking at what's best for the United States. Britain is a clear example of this. And maybe it is a good thing to counteract the tendencies of globalization, but it clearly is not a good thing when it comes to grappling with problems of climate change, nuclear weapons, or the COVID virus, or probably a couple more. And the world is going to have to grapple with these things. I don't see how you can live in a world where the current regime of North Korea is still there with the Kim family. And we've seen estimates by 2030, the North Koreans could have 200 nuclear weapons. This is a different world. It's not as if they have like 10 or 15 or 20, and half of them don't work. When they have that many nuclear weapons, some significant fraction of them will launch and they will detonate. And it's just a different kind of thing. So I see whatever the rhetoric is today, and today may be the low point in terms of U.S.-China relations, there's a lot of reason to think they're going to cooperate in the future, especially when China looks around and sees that if their allies, unquote, are Pakistan, North Korea, and Russia.
It's a fascinating question. And if I could ask one parting question before we go, which is with the historical perspective that you have on all things command and control and NC3 more broadly, thinking about the world in which we find ourselves, have things gotten so much more complex that, this communications piece of it, even if we address it, really leaves us with, so much more to work on? Or do you think that focusing a little bit more time, energy, and effort on this, prioritizing it perhaps a little bit more, that we can start to push things back in the other direction so that the complexity doesn't become overwhelming? You think there's a worthy chance putting our shoulders into this and maybe lowering the risk a bit?
I absolutely do. And what we need to do is, to carrying your suggestion a little bit further, is to ask how states are going to use the complexity. And what would an answer look like to that? Well, it might look like that the system is so complex that you really cannot go on alert for the United States. This is a regrettable outcome that nobody would want. But if you put it in those stark terms, it means that we have, in some sense, put billions and hundreds of $billions into weapon systems which we can't use because we can't control what's going to happen with them. And that'll get attention inside the Beltway. And I think also on this question of the complexity, other countries have faced this. I think the chance of a large nuclear war is low compared to the 1950s, but the chance of some nuclear war, probably involving Pakistan, North Korea, not involving US versus Russia or US versus China, is growing. And I think is higher than it ever was in the Cold War. That is some nuclear detonation in anger. Let's not forget that in the Cold War, neither side ever seriously considered a calculated strike on the other. All of the problems arose out of misunderstandings, cases that we had not considered. At no time did either side consider a professionally executed strike on the other to deal with them. You can't say that about North Korea and Pakistan today, or India. So some nuclear use, but it is small, and we have to violate some academic dogma here that says you can't have a limited nuclear war. I would much rather have a limited nuclear war than an all-out nuclear war.
This I can fervently agree with, and hopefully, some of these comms capabilities that we've been kicking around will give the ability to dial it down if and when that horrible event actually does come to fruition. Paul, we definitely want to say thank you for your time. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for all of the contributions you've made to this field over the years. Thanks for joining us here today.
Good to be with you, and thank you for launching this project because I think it's very important because it's going to have a large impact.
Thanks again, Paul. As always, thanks to our listeners. We'll be back next week with a new episode of The Fourth Leg. Be sure to join us. We're going to be speaking with the high priest of core boot himself, Ron Minnick from Google, about open source hardware, why the things that we have been talking about are so vulnerable and why they have to be built from the bottom up. Be sure to come back and join us and check it out. Until then, subscribe to the pod via SoundCloud, Spotify, you name it, you can find us, or we'll see you online via Twitter or our website. Until then, thanks again, everybody, for listening. We look forward to hearing from you.